The Bible is filled from cover to cover with the stories of ordinary folks just like you and me who had to make all sorts of difficult choices. Think about Eve, the first woman, how she held within her grasp a handful of empty promises in the Garden of Eden, and how she made her own difficult choice and she ate. Or the man Abraham, who was beckoned by a divine voice to move out into a great unknown, into an undiscovered country, and how he made his own difficult choice and took a step, and then another, and then another, and then another. Or the man Moses, who stayed the sting of the Egyptian slave driver's whip, and while looking into the horrified eyes of the oppressed, his own countrymen, made his own difficult choice, and denied his royal occupation to embrace a divine obligation. Or his successor, the man Joshua, who stood before the Hebrews, fresh from their wilderness and newly planted in their land of promise. They heard Joshua's famous challenge in Joshua 24, verse 15. Choose for yourselves today whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. But you know, a similar choice comes ringing down through the countless ages into our own hearing. Choose for yourselves today whom you will serve. Now, as we consider these significant moments of decision, a spiritual law of life becomes apparent, that there is really no neutrality in the things of God. Because, you see, Eve could not remain neutral in the battle between surrendering to the flesh and submitting to God. Caught between two destinies, either she would sup the forbidden fruit, or she would deny the flesh and be sustained by obedient faith. And Abraham could not be neutral in God's command to leave Haran while he remained on his doorstep. Caught between two destinies, either he would remain at home in fear of the unknown, or he would leave on faith. And Moses could not remain neutral in the treatment of his own people, sympathetic towards their oppression while enjoying all the privileges as a prince among their oppressors. He was caught between two destinies. But Hebrews 11, verse 24 and 25 says that when he had grown up, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing, rather, to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. You see, Moses understood the impasse that was before him, but he counted the cost, and in verse 26 of Hebrews 11, considered the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. And so, to remain neutral was to incur the reproach of the coming Messiah. But to choose to do nothing was in reality a choice against God. And Joshua could not both lead God's people to faithfulness and at the same time allow their faith to be stalled in neutrality. He and his family were caught between two destinies. And so he cries out, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Because there is no neutrality in the things of God. Perhaps the words of Jesus carry the heaviest weight, because in Luke 11, verse 23, he offers the clear and pointed admonition against neutrality when he says, "He who is not with me is against me, and he who does not gather with me scatters." And so Jesus' statement is directed at anyone who is not positively committed to him or to his cause, because, well, there is no neutrality in the things of God. And so, let's spend a few moments to examine this encounter in Luke 11, because Jesus' statement against neutrality, it comes as a main point at the end of a brief parable, where he says in verse 21 through 23 of Luke 11 that when a strong man, fully armed, guards his own house, his possessions are undisturbed. But when someone stronger than he attacks him and overpowers him, he takes away from him all his armor on which he had relied and distributes his plunder. And so here we're introduced to a strong man. And he's no ordinary man because his strength has set him apart. Now, there are men and there are strong men, but consider that getting the title of strong man can come only by demonstration because, well, one cannot simply talk strong, he must show his strength. And his strength is demonstrated by the fact that he is fully armed. This man's strength was not simply in his physique. He's prepared and equipped to handle any situation that he might encounter. And his strength is also demonstrated in his attitude because we're told by Jesus that he is on guard. And so we don't get an image of someone sleeping or neglecting his duty, but rather this strong man is vigilant in his charge. He will not be caught off guard. He will be ready to face whatever comes against him, with the result that his possessions are undisturbed. In fact, there's only one thing he can't handle. You guessed it, someone stronger. And so the stronger man attacks. But what would motivate him to do that? Why would he do that? I can only think of two possibilities in this scenario. Number one, because he can. You see, he wants to demonstrate that he has more power, more authority, more strength than this strong man. And because he desires what the strong man has in his possession. You see, he wants to liberate the possessions from the strong man's grip. And so the stronger man overpowers him, completely disarming him and redistributing all his plunder. And so we see the picture Jesus paints, and we hear the point he makes. But now we need to frame these remarks in the setting and the context. Because Jesus' parable about someone stronger and his remarks against neutrality, well, they were preceded by a miracle, where in Luke 11, verse 14, it says, "And Jesus was casting out a demon, and it was mute. When the demon had gone out, the mute man began to speak again." And Luke says that the crowds were amazed. And so a certain man was demon-possessed and unable to speak. He was in the complete control of an evil spirit, powerless to set himself free. He was occupied by a strong man, as it were. There was not much hope for him. Well, that is until Jesus, someone stronger, comes along and overpowers the spirit and releases the man from its possession. Now, what would motivate Jesus to do such a thing? I can think of only two possibilities. Number one, because he can. You see, Jesus sees an opportunity to demonstrate his power and his authority and his strength over the demon. And number two, because he desires to set the man free from the grip of the demon. You see, he wants to liberate the man from this spiritual slavery. Now, there were three reactions to Jesus' miracle. Because first, we hear that the crowds were amazed. And this, of course, is understandable. Second, in verse 16, it says that there were others to test Jesus who were demanding of him another sign. But a third response, nestled between these two, we learn that some of them said, "He casts out demons by Beelzebul, the ruler of the demons." Now, Beelzebul is a term which means the Lord of the Flies, or ruler of the dunghill. And this name was synonymous with Satan in the mind of the Jews. And so their response was literally to accuse Jesus of being the devil. Now, Jesus can't let that slide. And so he turns his attention to this particular response in verse 17 through 23 with three very simple arguments. And so, knowing their thoughts about him, he says to them in verse 17 and 18, "Any kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and a house divided against itself, it cannot stand." And so he asks, if Satan also is divided against himself, how will his kingdom stand? And so, if what they said were true, then Satan would be working against himself. But as a side here, I'd like for you to notice that Jesus acknowledges the existence of Satan, that he's a real spiritual being who opposes God and who oppresses people. And he is presented here by Jesus as possessing a real kingdom whose dominion is united against God. But in verse 19, Jesus adds another argument against their accusation, adding, "And if I by Beelzebul cast out demons, well then, by whom do your sons cast them out?" You see, if they argue that Satan would undermine his own efforts, and Jesus knows he is not Satan, then their claims reflect negatively on their own so-called exorcists. And so their accusation is actually a self-incriminating one. But Jesus adds a third argument against them in verse 20 through 23, when he explains, "But if I cast out demons by the finger of God, well, then the kingdom of God has come upon you. Because when a strong man who is fully armed guards his own house, his possessions are undisturbed. But," he adds, "when someone stronger than he attacks him and overpowers him, he takes away from him all his armor on which he had relied, and then distributes his plunder." And so Jesus is making a bold statement here about the strength of the two kingdoms that collided that day. Satan, armed with demonic spirits, under his dominion, powerful enough to cause a man to remain mute, is no match against Jesus, armed with the finger of God in his kingdom. Because Jesus is someone stronger. And Jesus overpowers darkness because he can, and because he desires to liberate those ensnared by the darkness. Now, think about this. If there is a kingdom of darkness which is organized and is united against God and his purpose, and if there is also a kingdom of light which is sovereign and is far superior, well then, what is the third kingdom, which remains in the twilight of neutrality, disengaged in this cosmic conflict? Friends, therein lies Jesus' point about neutrality, because there is no third kingdom. There is a strong man whose dominion seems indomitable. That is, until someone stronger arrives to overpower and disarm him, and ultimately liberates his plunder. And so it is Jesus who sees all of humanity under the authority of one of these two dominions. And so a non-commitment to him is to be engaged, knowingly or otherwise, in the purposes of his adversary. Because, well, there is no neutrality in the things of God. Now, if you'll allow him, Jesus will press this figure even farther in Luke 11:24 through 26 by adding that when the unclean spirit goes out of a man, it passes through waterless places, seeking rest. And not finding any, it says, I think I'll return to my house from which I came, meaning the life, the person that it was removed from. But Jesus adds that when it comes, it finds it swept and put in order. And so it goes and takes along 7 other spirits more evil than itself, and they go in and live. Jesus says the last state of that man becomes worse than the first. Now, in Matthew's account of this same event, in Matthew 12, verse 44, Jesus describes the house as being unoccupied. And there he uses a term which means empty, not occupied by any compelling force, not positively committed to any cause, neutral. And so the unoccupied house to which Jesus refers is the empty life of a person who is not positively committed to anything, someone trying to remain neutral. But of course, there is no neutrality in the things of God. And so Jesus reveals in Luke 11, verse 23, that he who is not with me is against me. He who does not gather with me scatters. And so just as Joshua placed a choice before the Hebrew people in his day, when he said in Joshua 24, verse 15, "Choose for yourselves today whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And so a door of opportunity is placed before each of us today and, well, every day by Jesus. And we are either for him or we are against him. We are gathering with him or we are scattering away. But bear this in mind. If we choose not to decide, well, we still have made a choice, because there is no neutrality in the things of God. Thanks so much for joining me tonight, as together we continue our quest to discover the real Jesus of the Gospels. And we found ourselves standing before an open door to allow Jesus, someone stronger, to enter in and begin to occupy our lives with his purpose. Won't you take a few steps more with me right here each Wednesday night as we together go in search of a Savior?